Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. In the Delhi edition of the Hindu, today we have a lot of important articles. I have chosen 8 important topics. We have 4 articles that require a detailed analysis as they are very important both for your prelims and mains. And we have 4 small articles that are relevant only for the prelims exam. So let's cover all these topics comprehensively so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. If you guys are benefiting from our initiatives, do support us through your likes, through your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So before we begin the discussion, also join our official Telegram channel. The link is provided in the description box below. Because after the session ends, we conduct a quiz on these topics which will help you revise these articles for the next year's prelims. With this, let's get started with the first article on page number 1 and as well as on page number 10 and also on page number 14. We have 3 important articles related to the recent developments in Bangladesh. I'm sure all of you know the crisis that has hit Bangladesh. In fact, we have been covering this topic from the last couple of weeks. And as we anticipated, the worst case outcome has happened in Bangladesh. So already a lot of things have been said and done about this topic. So today, I would like to club all these articles together and carry out a more elaborate, detailed discussion on the possible outcomes, the choices for India, the difficult choices for India, and evaluate the impact of this crisis on India's interests. So let's start with the very beginning. Let's understand what really happened in Bangladesh quickly. So over the last few days, Bangladesh was witnessing massive protests led by students against a quota system. This quota goes all the way back to 1971 when the country was liberated. The freedom fighters, the Bengali nationalists who had fought for the independence of the country from the clutches of Pakistan with India's help, they had been given a reservation under Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the founding father of Bangladesh. The freedom fighters who had sacrificed their lives, their livelihoods, their families for the sake of the nation, for the sake of liberating Bangladesh, they were recognized through this reservation system. A 30% quota had been reserved in education and jobs. But over the years, this quota was passed down to the children and grandchildren of the freedom fighters as well. And allegations came up that even relatives of these family members were misusing the quota. So essentially, this quota was affecting merit. And as a result, back in 2018, there were a set of protests against the government to abolish a part of this quota system. Following these protests in 2018, Sheikh Hasina, the then Prime Minister, had already abolished the quota system. But recently, a couple of months ago, a court in Bangladesh, which was looking into a related petition, it ordered the government to bring back the 30% quota. So this triggered the youth and the students who were already suffering from joblessness to come out on the streets and protest, eventually which led to the toppling of Sheikh Hasina's government. In fact, prior to this, Sheikh Hasina was already facing a number of challenges in Bangladesh. She has been accused of being an authoritarian leader in the last few years especially. Sheikh Hasina has crushed the opposition, the media, the civil society, and even arrested several opposition leaders, intellectuals, and eminent personalities. It has been alleged that Sheikh Hasina's former government had even rigged elections, thus eroding democracy and even constitutional principles and human rights in Bangladesh. Apart from this, over the last 4 years, Bangladesh's economy has been facing a crisis. In fact, Sheikh Hasina had played a big role in the growth of the Bangladeshi economy over the last few years. From 2009 to 2018, Sheikh Hasina was credited with regard to the socio-economic development and the overall welfare that had been done in the country. But after the pandemic, Bangladesh's economy took a massive hit. Its forex reserves have depleted, inflation level has been higher, and more importantly, there has been growing joblessness. This, in a way, was a very big contributing factor as the youth felt threatened by the 30% quota system, as there was a fear that the court orders would bring back the reservation system, which would further compromise merit and thus affect the opportunities available to the youth. In fact, Bangladesh was well on its way to become a developing nation in a couple of years. It would have been officially designated by the World Bank as a developing country. But following the economic crisis, Sheikh Hasina's image had taken a hit. The joblessness amongst the youth had increased social tensions as well. In fact, many of you might remember, a few months ago we had discussed a similar topic when large-scale protests broke out in Bangladesh, especially in Dhaka, which was carried out by garment factory workers. Because textile industry, garment industry is the backbone of Bangladeshi economy. Bangladesh happens to be a major producer of textiles and garments, even for all your major brands and labels. But the crisis that has hit the economy had affected the textile industry, and garment factory workers whose wages had been affected, they came out on the streets and protested, and this had already created a crisis in Bangladesh. Even then, Sheikh Hasina's government was accused of using brutal force against protesters, which had led to the death of few protesters. So essentially, Sheikh Hasina's unpopularity kept on increasing over the last few years. This had led Western governments to even interfere, particularly the United States, to even bring sanctions against some of the officials of the Bangladeshi government and security forces who were accused of committing human rights violations. In the recent elections that were held in January 2024, the United States raised concern about the allegations of rigging of elections, as it was not seen as free and fair elections. Because prior to the elections, Sheikh Hasina had arrested the opposition leaders, including Khaleda Zia, who heads the Bangladesh Nationalist Party. It was accused that Awami League was engaging in political violence on the ground, targeting the political opposition. Other groups like the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is a radical student-based organization aligned with extremist forces, was also banned recently in the country. And during the recent anti-quota protests, large-scale force was used, leading to the death of more than 400 protesters. So whatever happened eventually on Monday was a culmination of all these events. And apart from this, there are allegations of a bigger game being played in Bangladesh, a larger great game involving global powers. A competition for influence between United States, China, India, Pakistan could have also added fuel to this fire. There is intense speculation that intelligence agencies of these countries could have played a role in instigating the protests. Particularly the United States and Pakistan together stand accused of instigating the protests, and this apparently was countered to the extent possible by India's RAW to protect India's critical interests in Bangladesh. It's very interesting to note that the interests of India and US didn't align as far as Bangladesh was concerned, even though we are close strategic partners. The prime reason being Sheikh Hasina was someone who was balancing the relations between India and China. Sheikh Hasina was a great friend of India. The party Awami League has always been a pro-India party, and even if you look at the history of the party and the country, the Bengali nationalists, right, who have always been moderate and secular, they have remained pro-India. At the same time, Sheikh Hasina was balancing the ties with China without compromising India's core interests. But this is what caused the US possibly to target Sheikh Hasina. It's alleged that the US was not comfortable with Sheikh Hasina's proximity to China. In fact, Sheikh Hasina even gave a very controversial interview a few weeks ago, just before these developments. She said that a white diplomat had approached her asking for a military base in the country. Essentially, it was a reference to the United States, meaning an American diplomat had approached Sheikh Hasina asking for a military base for the United States. Again, we are in no position to verify how true this is or not, but the statement coming from a prime minister, sitting prime minister, does hold a lot of weight. And given the intense speculation, it's important to consider this possibility as well. The possibility of a larger great game involving these big powers and their intelligence agencies playing a covert game to carry out regime change in the country. So India had heavily relied upon the Awami League government headed by Sheikh Hasina to protect our core interests. As we discussed a few days ago, we share a very long border with Bangladesh. And historically, we have faced a lot of security threats from across the border. Northeast insurgents had found a safe haven in East Pakistan and later in Bangladesh when we had hostile governments. For example, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, when there was military rule, when the BNP, the opposition, currently before the protest which was in opposition, when BNP was in power, which was seen as a pro-Pakistan party, it was noticed that these hostile governments had encouraged anti-India forces, including terrorist organizations. We had seen a lot of border security challenges, be it drug trafficking, arms trafficking, cattle smuggling, human trafficking, and even the pumping of fake Indian currency notes from across the border. Pakistan essentially had got a free hand whenever these hostile governments were present in Bangladesh, thus threatening India's core security interests. And more importantly, India had very good ties with Sheikh Hasina's government. We had a lot of joint initiatives, projects and investments which had taken root, which had cemented the relationship, including a very strong economic relationship. But India was comfortable as long as the pro-Pakistan elements were kept out. And even when Sheikh Hasina stood accused of being authoritarian and crushing human rights and democratic rights, India didn't utter a word as we were following a very realistic foreign policy. Instead of focusing on ideals, India was driven by a realistic approach, as it should be. And India focused on maintaining the close ties with Sheikh Hasina, and we never criticized the internal developments under Sheikh Hasina's rule. So India was comfortable as long as Pakistan was kept at a distance and as long as Sheikh Hasina was balancing the ties with China without harming India's interests. But now the entry of United States and the American self-interest runs contradictory to India's own interests. There were allegations that the US was aiming at regime change since several months. And now that it has happened, these allegations have strengthened. Now this is like a deja vu for India, because these events have been recurring across our neighborhood. Few years ago, in Afghanistan in 2021, the Taliban took over the country, toppling the civilian government. The then Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, also fled the country, just like Sheikh Hasina fled the country. Then a couple of years ago in Sri Lanka in 2022, following the economic crisis, which was blamed on the mismanagement of the economy by the Rajapaksa brothers, the protesters stormed the presidential palace, leading Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Mahinda Rajapaksa to flee the country. So across our neighborhood, we are witnessing such instability, be it Maldives, be it Nepal, be it Myanmar, and this is an absolute nightmare for India, and several experts are even pointing out that this is a shortcoming of our neighborhood policy under the Modi government. Because indeed, this is a big setback for India. If at all there was a greater game going on involving US, China, Pakistan and India, the fall of Sheikh Hasina's government indeed marks a major setback for India. It does come out as a shortcoming of India's foreign policy as well. Now in this difficult context, let's understand what has happened and what are the outcomes and what possible options exist for India in the coming days. Because India is faced with some very difficult choices right now. But first of all, let me give you one clarification. I have seen many media reports and so-called social media influencers calling this a military coup. Now, please understand this is totally incorrect. A military coup is when the military steps in, topples the government and takes over power for itself. But that's not what has happened in Bangladesh. Yes, the Bangladeshi army chief did issue an ultimatum to Sheikh Hasina after the protests escalated. A 45-minute notice was given for Sheikh Hasina to pack her bags and leave the country. But the army in itself has not shown power inclination as of now. The army chief, in fact, and the Bangladeshi army in general, they at least remained loyal to Sheikh Hasina's government over the last 15 or 16 years. During Sheikh Hasina's rule, where she had won 4 consecutive back-to-back elections, the army had never challenged the authority of the civilian government, and it had functioned very well under civilian leadership. So it was only during this worst case scenario where large scale protests had broken out, 400 civilian deaths had occurred. There was immense pressure on Sheikh Hasina to step down. It was in this context that the army chief issued an ultimatum, and as soon as Sheikh Hasina resigned and fled to India, the army chief clearly announced that they are forming an interim government. Is that clear? So the army has not captured power for itself. So it's not a coup, essentially. The army has ensured that an unpopular leader steps down to ensure that normalcy, stability is restored. When the country was staring at a complete security collapse, the army stepped in and ensured that the government there is a change in the government itself and in the leadership to bring back and restore that normalcy and stability. And as soon as this was done, the army has called in all the other parties which were in the opposition. The BNP, Bangladesh Nationalist Party, and the Jamaat, both of which are a concern for India because of their pro-Pakistan inclination and their ties with radical forces and radical elements. In fact, BNP and Jamaat have even been accused of targeting religious minorities, including the Bengali Hindu community, which has been under attack. There have been disturbing reports of targeted attacks against Hindu households and Hindu temples as well. In fact, there has been a history in the recent past where even during Durga Puja, the pandals were targeted as well by some of the conservative radical elements, which are pro-Pakistan elements. This obviously has raised concern for India regarding the well-being of the Hindu community, the Bengali community, and the minorities in the country. Sheikh Hasina was our best bet, as Awami League has always remained moderate and secular, committed to its nationalist credentials. But now with Sheikh Hasina gone, there is a greater risk with regard to the well-being and safety of the minorities. Now that is exactly what India is focused upon right now. An interim government has already been sworn in, as reported in today's article. Mohd Yunus, the founder of Grameen Bank, the Nobel Peace Laureate, who had been targeted by Sheikh Hasina politically because of their political differences, has now come back to the country at the invitation of the army and the interim government. Mohd Yunus will be heading this interim government as a chief advisor, along with a few other leaders from various opposition parties. Apart from BNP and Jamaat, the army has invited another party, the Jatiya Party, which was formed by a former military ruler, a military dictator that was established in 1986. Even the Jatiya Party is a concern for India, as previously under this military dictator who founded the Jatiya Party, Bangladesh had taken a stance against India in favor of Pakistan, allowing hostile elements to flourish in the country. So essentially, this interim government which has been formed, even though it will be headed by an eminent personality, an intellectual, a Nobel laureate, the bigger concern for India would be the role of BNP, Jamaat and Jatiya Party members. Because most of them come from conservative radical sections aligned with Pakistan and extremist forces. And this is what really concerns and bothers India. So now, what can be India's game plan? One bigger challenge for India as of now is what should India do with Sheikh Hasina? As of now, Sheikh Hasina fled the country, landed in India, as you all know, in Delhi, and she and her sister are being securely protected by India at a secret location, considering the risk to their lives. Now, this again is like a deja vu moment for South Asia, because many years ago in 1975, Hasina's father, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the Bangabandhu, the founding father, the leader of the liberation movement, who was backed by India back in 1971, his entire family was assassinated by rogue members of the Bangladeshi army who were acting at the behest of Pakistan. This assassination led to the toppling of the then Awami League government, which brought military rule in the country in mid-1970s. Most members of Mujibur Rahman's family were killed in this brutal assassination, but Sheikh Hasina and her sister survived, and they were brought to India under India's protection. Then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who shared very good personal relations with Mujibur Rahman's family, ensured that India's intelligence agency RAW would protect Sheikh Hasina and her sister, and for large part of their younger age, they grew up in India under India's protection. It was only later that Sheikh Hasina and her sister would enter Bangladeshi politics by the late 70s and 80s, then lead Awami League back to its revival. So in many ways, this is again like a deja vu where again India has to protect Sheikh Hasina and her sister. So India would happily do it given the historical connection and the emotional connect that we have. In fact, many former leaders, the likes of Pranab Mukherjee, Jyoti Basu, they have often labeled Sheikh Hasina as a daughter of India. That is the kind of close connect and bond that we have shared. And in a way, it's about being grateful to Sheikh Hasina as well for all the contribution she has done to India-Bangladesh relations. Because honestly, without Sheikh Hasina coming to power in 2009, we couldn't have stabilized the Northeast region by tackling the insurgency that was prevalent. It was Sheikh Hasina who assisted the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to tackle the threat of Northeast insurgent groups by crushing the safe havens that existed. Be it Ulfa, NSC and the Bodo outfits, they were all crushed by Sheikh Hasina, and most of the insurgents and terrorists were handed over to India. And that is what allowed India to stabilize the Northeast and bring down most of these insurgencies. Today, Bodo insurgency doesn't exist. We have struck a peace accord. Naga insurgents are negotiating with India, at least a faction of the Naga insurgents. Again, a faction of Ulfa is negotiating with India for a peace process. This was all possible only because of Sheikh Hasina's support. Border security improved, organized crime was better tackled, illegal migration went down as Bangladesh's economy started performing better under Sheikh Hasina. Plus, Sheikh Hasina granted transit access to India to connect with the Northeast, which was a long-standing demand for India. This allowed India to take up critical connectivity projects, which are of strategic importance. This would not only allow us to build alternate routes to the Northeast, which can help us bypass Siliguri corridor, which is a weak point for India, but it aligns with our Look East Act East policy, as it allows us to connect with Myanmar and Southeast Asian countries. So India had great plans, great ambitions, and we had even executed many successful connectivity projects. We had interconnected our roads, we had railway projects, including the Maitri Express, railway lines which were financed by India, the Akura-Agartala railway line, the Kulla-Mongla port railway line, which would have benefited trade, facilitated movement of people and goods. We had many other projects, including the Maitri thermal power plant that was inaugurated, many new proposed road and rail projects. We interconnected our waterway networks. The waterway inland navigation networks on Ganga, Brahmaputra, Barak, they were interconnected with Bangladeshi rivers to create alternate routes to Northeast India. India was playing a role in Mongla port and Chittagong port, the strategic ports of Bangladesh, which allowed us to counter the Chinese presence and influence at these strategic ports. Now, all these key projects will be under threat. We had given around $8 billion worth of concessional loans as line of credit. So the future of these investments are at risk, and there is no clarity as to how things will develop going forward. So now the big challenge for India would be, how will India deal with the presence of Sheikh Hasina in the country? So given the assistance Sheikh Hasina has always given, the way in which she has protected India's interest, and the way in which India has been connected historically, emotionally to the family of Sheikh Hasina, it's only our duty, moral obligation to give her temporary asylum at least. So India has indeed done the right thing by offering her shelter and protection for the time being, given the threat that was present to her life. Because in Bangladesh, there has been a history of political assassinations. Whenever such protests have broken out, several leaders have been taken out in the country. So India indeed did the right thing initially, but now the question is, should India provide asylum to Sheikh Hasina and her sister? This is a bigger question. Because for a second, think about this from Bangladesh's perspective. Now you have a new interim government, right? And all these parties, be it the BNP, the Jamaat, the Jatiya party, then the current chief advisor who would head the interim government, Muhammad Yunus, and the people of Bangladesh in general, they all have hatred towards Sheikh Hasina, and correctly so. As I told you, Sheikh Hasina had become a very unpopular leader. That is the reality we need to accept. Right? Just because Sheikh Hasina was a friend of India doesn't mean we can ignore the unpopularity on the ground. Sometimes you need to keep idealism away and look at the realistic goals which are achievable. So if India has to repair the damage and get back in the game and protect our interests, protect our investments and our influence, we need to work with the interim government. We don't have a choice. Which means we'll have to work with the Bangladeshi army, work with Mohd Yunus, because Sheikh Hasina had targeted Mohd Yunus politically. Multiple cases were filed. He had been arrested on criminal charges. Plus, we already have bad blood with BNP and Jamaat, as India has always labeled these parties as pro-Pakistan conservative radical forces. Now, we don't have a choice other than to engage with them. But if we host Sheikh Hasina for any longer period of time and grant asylum, this would affect India's image. In Bangladesh, India would be perceived as a protector of an unpopular leader, and that is something India cannot afford at this point. So ideally, what India should do is, we have given immediate shelter, which was the right thing to do given the circumstances. But now, India should be working the diplomatic channels with other close partners like UK or Saudi Arabia or other countries to secure a different country as an asylum, as a permanent shelter for Sheikh Hasina. Also, there are reports that Sheikh Hasina might go back to Bangladesh a few days later, once normalcy comes back. But either ways, India should be clear that Sheikh Hasina can't remain in India permanently, because that would hurt India's image and further affect our ties with the interim government and the key players, including the army, the BNP, the Jamaat, and more importantly, the people of Bangladesh. So creating the right perception is very critical. And one flaw of India's foreign policy in the neighborhood has always been that we have put all our eggs in one basket. Be it in Nepal, be it in Sri Lanka, Maldives, in Myanmar, we have always relied on one party, one leader, or one government to protect our interests. The moment there is a change in government due to such circumstances, India is lost in the region and as well, which creates a major challenge for India. See what happened in Maldives. We relied heavily on the Maldivian Democratic Party, leaders like Ibrahim Soleh, Mohammad Nasheed. But the moment the opposition got elected and we got leaders like Yamin Gayoom, Mohammad Muizu, they would obviously retaliate because of India's past with the other parties. Same with Sri Lanka as well. Look at the divide between the Rajapaksa family and India, which had developed. And once Rajapaksa family came back to power, our ties were severely affected. The same happens in Nepal. Look at leaders like KP Oli who have come back to power. We rely heavily on other opposition parties and leaders, but when the other side comes to power, our influence is lost, and even worse, those governments will turn against India. The same is the case with Myanmar as of now. Given the situation in Myanmar, we have relied heavily on the military regime and in a way indirectly backed the military regime as well by not condemning its violations. And we have no contacts or no engagement as such with the ethnic armed groups and the other rival factions, which might even topple the military regime someday. Most experts are predicting a similar scenario in Myanmar. They say Myanmar is maybe days or weeks away from a complete collapse, given that armed groups have captured a lot of territory. And if not a complete collapse, there might be a fragmentation of Myanmar in the coming days. So this will be an absolute nightmare for India. We can't afford both Myanmar and Bangladesh collapsing at the same time. This would be a worst case scenario for Northeast India, given that Northeast insurgents and organized criminals have always found shelter in these two countries. Hostile powers like Pakistan and China, they have always leveraged their influence in Bangladesh and Myanmar to breed anti-India forces and support insurgent and terrorist activities against India. So if India has to address these concerns, we need to engage with the interim government. We need to engage with Mohd Yunus, the army, the BNP, the Jamaat, and more importantly, the people. So creating the right perception is important. And at the same time, we should decide the engagement with the West, with the United States. Because clearly India, US are at loggerheads on several critical issues. Though it is called as a defining partnership of the century, though we are called as strategic partners, clearly India-US interests don't match, and apparently US has been acting against Indian interests in several cases. For example, if you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, India-US are on complete opposite sides. The Americans are not happy with India's position, where India is almost indirectly backing Russia. Then if you look at the attempts to revive Khalistan movement, particularly in Western countries, clearly Western governments have not cooperated with India, leading to concerns for India about the true intention of the Western governments. Now, added to this is the complication in Bangladesh, where our interests are on the opposite sides. As the allegations go, US played a big role in regime change by working with Pakistan, which runs counter to Indian interests, which could harm India severely. So this casts a shadow on India-US relations as well. So we need to determine the future course of action with the West, with the US particularly, and how India will stabilize the region. So one option that India has right now would be to engage with those who are currently in power, BNP, Jamaat, the army and everyone else, to secure our core interests. See, one thing that works in the field of international relations is money. I know it's a very cold-hearted statement, but that's the reality. One leverage that we still have in Bangladesh is the incentives that we can offer, the investments that we can offer to the future interim government. Right? The current interim government would also be looking to stabilize the economy, to rebuild the economy and create jobs. Now, this is where India can be a big player. We already have given sufficient loans, $8 billion worth of loans. We are involved in critical projects, which is immensely beneficial to Bangladesh. So using those investments and incentives, India has to lure the interim government, those who matter like Mohd, Yunus, the army chief, and even the opposition, which we don't like, the BNP and Jamaat. Now, it's not about ideals or ideologies anymore. It's about being more realistic. We have been realistic in the case of Myanmar. We have been realistic with Sheikh Hasina, ignoring her authoritarian tendencies. So the time has come to do the same in Bangladesh as well. Because in Afghanistan, we've already paid the price. In Afghanistan, when Taliban took over, we had no engagement with Taliban and we kept labeling Taliban as a terror group. And we had an idealistic approach to not talk to the Taliban. But by then, the world had moved on. Most powers had struck a deal with the Taliban. They just saw Taliban as a radical political outfit. They struck their deals and protected their interests while India was left behind. We reached out to Taliban only after the crisis had begun. We engaged with Taliban only after the government had fallen and only after Taliban had come to power. But over the last few months, we have managed to engage with Taliban and regain some influence, but still it is a little too late. So one should hope that doesn't happen in Bangladesh. We should immediately engage with all the elements. So India has already taken a step. Prime Minister Modi and others have congratulated Mohd Yunus, the caretaker of the interim government. And also India has urged that the interim government should protect the minorities, especially the Bengali Hindu community. So there's nothing wrong in India expressing its concerns, but we need to engage with these elements, build that influence and ensure that we protect the core interest which really matters, which is to keep Pakistan at bay, keep any adverse action of China at bay, and ensure that our investments are protected, our interests are protected. So this is what we take away from this important development. These are the difficult choices we are faced with. So please take up this practice question. Evaluate the impact of recent political turmoil in Bangladesh on India. So for this question, first in the introduction, you can present the context. You can explain what has happened in Bangladesh, maybe relate this with what's happening in the neighborhood as well, right? And in the body, talk about the implications, the political, diplomatic implications, the economic implications, because Bangladesh is our largest trading partner in the South Asia region. We have a $13 billion worth trade relationship, and we enjoyed a trade surplus as India had more exports to the country. We were the primary supplier of essential items like fuel, energy, and several other essential commodities. So India had a massive trade surplus, which was beneficial to India. There was a proposed free trade agreement, which we were negotiating, which is now uncertain. If everything went well, maybe by the end of the year, we would have had an FTA with Bangladesh. So now this will fall apart. The connectivity projects which we were pursuing, which we had already set up, they are already under threat. So point out the economic implications, the strategic implications, the security implications for the Northeast and across the border areas, and then conclude with a solution, a way forward. What should India do? Right? So that essentially completes your answer. Next, we have a couple of articles on page 1. So next we have a couple of articles on page 1 and 14, which is related to monetary policy. According to the article, the central bank, RBI, and the Monetary Policy Committee, which is responsible for fixing the policy rate, which is responsible for handling the monetary policy of India, has decided to keep the repo rate unchanged at 6.5%. Now, this is the 9th consecutive time that repo rate has remained unchanged. So this has some implications, and you need to understand the logic behind it. There are some key points to cover here as well. And also there is a very interesting column that talks about monetary policy of central banks and how it can impact financial markets and how financial markets in turn can affect monetary policy. So let's carry out an analysis here. So RBI has essentially kept the repo rates unchanged at 6.5%. Now first, what is repo rate? From a prelims point of view, there are some important facts to cover as well. Repo rate is nothing but the rate at which the central bank lends to the commercial banks, right? So this lending rate of the central bank to the commercial banks will eventually determine interest rate in the economy. So repo rate is a key policy rate. It's the primary policy rate, the benchmark policy rate for the Monetary Policy Committee to manage liquidity in the economy. In order to strike a balance between inflation and growth, liquidity needs to be managed at the right level, and Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI does this by controlling the key policy rate, which is the repo rate, the rate at which the central bank lends to the commercial banks. Now, what is the Monetary Policy Committee? It was established in 2016 by amending the RBI Act, and it is responsible for the monetary policy framework. It comprises of 6 members, including the governor of the RBI, who is the ex officio chairperson, and there are 2 other members from the RBI, the deputy governor of monetary policy and another officer nominated from the central board of RBI. So from the RBI, there are 3 representatives, including the governor, and there are 3 members from the government who are appointed from the government. 3 persons appointed by the central government. There is a committee chaired by the cabinet secretary which decides on these appointments. So government also gets to have a say in the monetary policy through these 3 members. So decisions here are taken by majority. If there is a tie, the governor's vote will prevail. This is the composition and structure. Now this Monetary Policy Committee has the primary mandate to determine the policy rates, to manage liquidity and fight inflation while promoting growth. So under the changes that were done in the Finance Act of 2016, an inflation target has been set for the Monetary Policy Committee. Inflation should be maintained, CPI inflation should be maintained at an ideal range of 4% with a range of plus or minus 2%, which means the minimum inflation should be 2%, maximum should be 6%, and ideal is 4%. This is the range prescribed for the MPC. If the inflation level remains above 6% or below 2% for 3 quarters, then that is seen as a failure of the Monetary Policy Committee. It's seen as a failure of the monetary policy in achieving the inflation target. So over the last several months, RBI has remained focused on containing inflation, because according to data, food inflation in particular has remained very stubborn. Even though headline inflation has moderated and core inflation also has moderated, within the headline component, food inflation has remained very, very persistent. Is that clear? See, headline inflation is overall retail level inflation measured through CPI. This basket of CPI, it includes food, fuel and other commodities. But since food has a very high allocation, the prices of food grains, dairy, meat and fruits and vegetables, which are very volatile, it directly influences the inflation levels. Fuel level inflation has generally gone down over the last few months, but the real concern has become food inflation. So core inflation is when you take out food and fuel inflation from headline inflation. So you take headline inflation, the retail CPI inflation, deduct the food and fuel inflation, you get your core inflation. So core inflation is seen as a more stable indicator. So core inflation has moderated. Headline inflation in general also is still within range. But problem is it is inching upwards and it has remained persistently higher and stubborn because of the persistent food inflation. the supply side constraints in agriculture, the erratic rainfall and weather patterns, the poor logistics on the back end, the large wastage which happens with regard to fruits, vegetables and other food items has kept food inflation persistently high, which is hurting the common man. Hence, RBI has remained extremely focused on containing inflation, and it has kept repo rate at 6.5%. Now, here we need to understand the links of monetary policy with financial markets, because financial markets react immediately to monetary policy changes. Right? For example, we recently saw a very disturbing development a few days ago. There was a bloodbath in the stock markets in India and around the world, particularly in Asian markets. This was tied to the monetary policy of Japan and United States. It triggered a fear of recession, leading to a massive global sell-off, causing one of the biggest bloodbaths in recent times. So this has led to the loss of investor asset value. It has hurt economies, developing emerging economies like India. Hence the article, the column that we have on page 10, it's exploring this deadly link, the volatile link between monetary policy and the financial markets. How financial markets are playing a bigger role and how it can actually impact monetary policy. So let's take a look at this. But first we need to understand the role of the policy rate, which is repo rate in the case of India. The key policy rate is used by the central bank to strike this balance between growth and inflation. Now, let's say when inflation is inching upwards, right? This will erode the value of money. It will hurt the common man by making all commodities expensive, right? So it will create a vicious cycle as well, which can affect the macroeconomy. So central banks are often obsessed with fighting inflation, and correctly so. So they increase the policy rate. In India's case, the repo rate. The Monetary Policy Committee of RBI will increase the repo rate so that the cost of borrowing will increase. Right? Because this is the rate at which RBI is lending to commercial banks, which determines the liquidity level. So if the rate is higher, commercial banks will borrow less from the central bank. They will have less liquidity to give out fresh loans, and the interest rate of these loans would inch upwards. So this will deter the borrowers from borrowing money because of the higher interest rate. So investors, big companies, they will reduce their borrowing, which means they'll not expand their activities, which means more jobs will not be created. Right? So inflation control might hurt growth. There is an inverse relationship here between growth and inflation when it comes to monetary policy. So this reduces the spending power, reduces the demand side pressure, thus bringing inflation under control. Right? So that is the idea behind increasing repo rate. It has to pass down, it has to trickle down the economy, eventually reduce the spending power. Right? But the risk here is, if it's not well managed, it can hurt growth and increase joblessness. It can hurt the employees and workers very severely. On the other hand, policy rate, if it is brought down, right, loans become cheaper. So as loans become cheaper, there will be more borrowing in the market by retail investors, by investors and large companies. And as a result, there would be more liquidity, more demand, and that helps in boosting growth. It helps in expanding the economy, creating jobs. So how the central bank manages the monetary policy, the key policy rate, is very, very crucial. Too much of focus on inflation control can hurt growth, leading to joblessness. Too much focus on just growth will lead to a liquidity surge, causing inflation, which can hurt the common man, which can erode the value of the money. So this is always a dicey situation because there is an inversely proportional relationship that exists here. Now, whatever decision the central bank takes, financial markets closely watch those trends. Obviously, financial markets are interested more in growth. They want to be bullish. And as you know, most markets, they are driven by sentiments. They are driven by emotions. The moment monetary policy is announced, saying that we are focusing on inflation control, increasing the rate further, or retaining the existing rates, this is seen as a negative sentiment, and the markets tend to crash. They tend to sell off. Right? And the opposite happens when there is a growth momentum which is given through the monetary policy. But recently what happened was, there was a panic selling that was triggered based on the assumption of a global recession. So in Japan, the central bank surprised everyone by increasing the rates, which was very unlikely, because for several years, for almost decades, Japan has been an economy which is on a deflationary trend. It has stagnated as an economy as well, and interest rates were almost zero in the country. But all of a sudden, Japan increased the rates relatively to around 2%, leading to fears that Japan is focusing on inflation control, leading to fears that growth will be compromised. And this led to a massive sell-off across Asian markets. Followed by this, the US monetary policy, which also focused on the growth concerns in the economy, because several companies haven't performed up to mark. If you look at Intel, for example, right? If you look at the tech giants, they've all laid off people on a massive scale, leading to fears of a global recession, because there are vulnerabilities in the global economy, from ongoing wars to various other concerns, right? So there are genuine concerns that there might be a recession. So as the US monetary policy was out, and as there were growth concerns in the US tech industry, this triggered panic selling in the markets, leading to a massive outflow of capital. Right? The Indian markets crashed. There was a fear that a recession is looming, right? And interest rates are going to shoot up, leading to a full imbalance between the objectives of the markets and the objectives of the central bank. Now, however, the assessment by Hindu shows that this fear of a recession was largely exaggerated. That's why the markets have recovered so quickly as well. If any of you have been investing, you would have noticed that the very next day after the sell-off, markets have very quickly recovered, even leading to a significant jump, because these fears were largely overblown. So this is where policymakers have to keep in mind the links of monetary policy with financial markets, how closely they are interconnected, how financial markets react can impact the decision making of the monetary policy decision makers. So this is something that raises a concern, because financial markets are driven by their own objectives, which is usually driven by sentiments, emotions, and it's driven by the growth momentum. If there is no growth momentum, the markets will crash. But monetary policy has a bigger objective to serve, to keep inflation under check while giving enough support for growth, right? But this pressure of pleasing the markets is creating challenges for monetary policy makers. For the central bank, for the monetary policy committee, this becomes an incredible challenge, and it's important for the central banks to keep this in mind and take this into account. Now, one other reason why this massive selling occurred is because of something called carry trade. In economies like Japan, interest rates were near zero, right? So what investors did, they borrowed from Japan at near zero rates with absolutely no cost, and they invested this in high growth economies where they could easily earn upwards of 8%, which was a very profitable scenario. So this practice is called carry trade, where investors borrow from one country where interest rates is very low, take that money and invest that in other high growth economies where the interest rates are higher. But the moment Japan increased its rates, these investors who had carried out carry trade, they pulled their investments from the high growth economies like India, leading to this significant crash in markets. This had happened previously as well during the 2008-2009 global recession. During the subprime crisis which had hit US and then the global economy, US had dropped interest rates to near zero as well. The US Federal Reserve, had dropped interest rates significantly. So several investors, they resorted to carry trade. They borrowed from US with little cost to borrowing, invested heavily in emerging markets like India where interest rates were higher. But the moment the US started tapering off the policy support, the quantitative easing, as it was called, as it started withdrawing this accommodative policy, pro-growth policy, which is called the tapering of quantitative easing, these investors, they pulled out from India. There was a flight of capital from India, which became known as the taper tantrum. Essentially, investors were throwing a tantrum. Because US was rising its rates again, they pulled the investments here because their cost of investment would increase. Also, US being a more stable economy, they would any day go back and invest there compared to high-risk developing emerging economies. So this is something that policymakers have to keep in mind. There are two things monetary policy decision makers have to keep in mind. One, the reaction of financial markets. Second, the linkages with global economy. See, today we live in an interconnected, globalized world where shares can be bought and sold at the click of a button within seconds in real time. So once any such decision comes out, the sentiments are affected, immediately driving either a buyout or a sell-off. So this creates tremendous pressure on policymakers. They can't respond so quickly, right? On one hand, they have to keep the sentiments of the markets in mind and understand that there are global economic factors which are not under our control. A war in some country or a destabilization of the supply chain somewhere in the world, right? Or a crisis, economic crisis in some part of the world. The policies of other countries like Japan, for example. Japan had to increase its interest rate because of its internal compulsions. So Japan's decision, the central bank's decision in Japan to raise the rate affected every country in the world, including India. So we have no control over these external factors, but monetary policy makers have to keep this in mind going forward. So that is the challenge when it comes to monetary policy decision making. So please take up this practice question, evaluate the difficulty in implementing monetary policy in the presence of global financial markets. So based on our discussion, please write an answer to this. Let's see how many of you can write an answer and post that in the comment section. Now let's look at an editorial on page number 10 that's related to a recent verdict against Google in an antitrust case. This is again a very important topic with regard to economy. So I'm sure you would have heard of all the big tech companies, the big tech giants, be it Google, Meta, Apple, Microsoft, etc. All the big tech giants have been accused of antitrust policies, anti-competitive policies. Now, what do you mean by this? It essentially means that those companies which have a dominant position in the market, they try to exploit, abuse the dominant position to create a monopoly for themselves, which is against the spirit of competition. So this will hurt innovation. It will hurt the smaller competitors. They can never compete with giants like Apple, Microsoft, or Google. If they abuse their dominant position, misuse that for maintaining their monopoly, this can hurt consumer interest, consumer experience, and consumer prices as well. Right? So in US and even in European Union and also in many other jurisdictions from South Korea to Australia, these companies have been facing antitrust, anti-competitive suits. In India as well, at the Competition Commission of India, these big tech giants have been dragged on the allegations of their exploitative policies, which establishes their monopoly by abusing the dominant position they have in the market. Many years ago, there was a similar ruling against Microsoft. Almost 25 years ago, I think a quarter of a century ago, Microsoft already had a dominant position with regard to operating systems through its Windows software. So Microsoft was seen to be abusing its dominant position to maintain that monopoly, which was stifling competition and innovation and hurting the consumers. So back then, a US court had delivered a landmark antitrust ruling against Microsoft, restricting these monopolistic tendencies of tech companies like Microsoft, which completely changed the landscape of the IT industry. The Silicon Valley itself in the US underwent a radical transformation following this landmark judgment. A similar landmark judgment was delivered recently against Google, again in the United States. Google was accused of entering into these exclusive agreements with smartphone makers. I'm sure all of you would have noticed in your phones, in your iPhones manufactured by Apple, or even in other Android phones manufactured by Samsung and other manufacturers. Google apps, they come pre-installed, especially its search engine. Its search engine and its browser, Google Chrome. They come pre-installed because this is part of a exclusive agreement. There is an exclusivity agreement between Google and Apple, Google and Samsung and others. This, in a way, benefits the smartphone makers as well. They don't have to invest too much, focus too much on developing their own search engines. Like Apple, for example, it doesn't have its own search engine as such. It does have a browser, the Safari, but even Apple has found it more easier to rely on Google's Chrome because it is a cost-cutting measure for them. Right? Other Android phone makers, they've already relied on Google's Play Store, Google's other applications, including its search engine and browser. So they have these exclusivity agreements where Google provides these apps which almost have a monopolistic dominating position in the market. Right? There is no doubt the user experience is great, but problem is if one company maintains this control, enters into these exclusivity agreements, how will small companies compete? Tomorrow, let's say there is a startup which wants to build a new search engine, a new and a better browser than Chrome. They will never be able to compete because no phone manufacturer will pre-install those apps. Consumers will not even be aware of it because they can never compete with a company like Google. So this stifles competition, it affects innovation, it affects the consumers eventually, right? So this court in the United States has clearly labeled Google as a monopolist tech giant. The same view is held against other companies as well, like Meta, Apple, Microsoft and others. So the court has ruled that Google was exploiting its dominant position in the search engine market and in the browser market by entering into these exclusivity agreements with phone makers like Apple and Samsung. So going forward, this cannot be done because of the court ruling. Now this will have an outcome. This will have a big impact on the tech industry. If such exclusivity agreements are essentially prohibited, even the European Union has done something similar as well. That you can't have such exclusivity agreements, you can't preload the devices with the apps of one particular company, which allows them to dominate the market, monopolize the market. So this could have a positive effect. It could help the consumers, it could help small startups, small competitors to focus more on research, innovation, and other tech giants can also develop their own products to rival Google. The downside would be it could affect companies like Apple, Samsung, because now they'll have to invest on their own to develop their own platforms, which earlier they were relying on Google at a much cheaper cost. But either ways, the writer, the editorial essentially is very clear that this is going to benefit the consumer. This will set a precedent for such antitrust cases around the world. Right? It can set a example for India as well, which is looking into similar concerns against the tech giants like Google and others. So that is what we take away from this important editorial. Next, we have a column on page 10 related to environment and ecology. This column is focused on a landmark judgment to the Supreme Court that was delivered few months ago in April. The MK Ranjitsinh case. I hope you guys have attended previous sessions. We have discussed this topic many times. I've covered the MK Ranjitsinh case previously. Now this is a landmark order, a judgment from the Supreme Court of India in the field of climate change and environment ecology. Because through the MK Ranjitsinh case, the Supreme Court held that humans have a right against the adverse impact of climate change. It was held that citizens of India have a basic human right, essentially a fundamental right, against the adverse impact of climate change. So this has very positive implications as far as climate action is concerned, which means the state can be held accountable because climate change can adversely affect the people, right? It can affect the most vulnerable sections, coastal communities, farmers, tribal communities, women. The vulnerable sections will be more affected, and such a ruling declaring the right to be protected against the adverse effect of climate change is indeed a landmark judgment. But however, the judgment missed focusing on the non-human aspect of environment. Because the writer says this case, the MK Ranjitsinh case versus Union of India, it was essentially about conserving the great Indian bustard. The great Indian bustard, I hope you know, is a threatened bird. It's a critically endangered bird on the IUCN Red List. You can see the great Indian bustard over here. It's quite tall. It is known for its unique flight characteristics, and usually it is found in dry grasslands and arid, semi-arid habitats. So from Rajasthan to Gujarat to Madhya Pradesh, even interior Karnataka, this was the historical range of the great Indian bustard, which is native to the Indian subcontinent. But over decades and centuries, due to habitat destruction, hunting, poaching, and climate change, this bird has been driven to the verge of extinction. Today, hardly 150 to 200 birds remain in Gujarat and Rajasthan. This is the last remaining habitat. In Gujarat and Rajasthan, in the arid, semi-arid regions over here, hardly 150 to 200 individuals are left, which essentially pushes this bird to the brink of extinction. So no wonder it is critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. Now, right now, conservationists, environmental groups, they are really concerned about the survival of the species because of the clean renewable energy projects that have been proposed in Gujarat and Rajasthan. I hope you know Gujarat, Rajasthan both have tremendous potential for solar energy and wind energy. The state governments and even the center, they have ambitious plans for these mega projects, these linear projects. The problem is, solar projects will result in the establishment of power grids and high tension power lines. Wind energy projects will also rely on these high tension lines and power grids, along with the tall turbines which keep rotating. Now, these linear projects are a direct threat to the bird. The great Indian bustard, which doesn't have easy maneuverability, right? It's very hard for this bird to detect incoming obstruction quickly, and because of the bird being slightly heavier as well, it can't maneuver very quickly. So there have been many incidents where the bird crashes into the blades of the turbine and gets killed, or it gets electrocuted on these power grids. So these linear projects, power projects, solar and wind projects, clean energy projects, they are a major threat. It's a survival threat. So there is exclusive focus on the conservation of the great Indian bustard, but in the M.K. Ranjitsinh case, the Supreme Court refused to strike down these projects because, according to the Supreme Court, these clean projects are in the interest of energy transition. Because see, under Paris Agreement, we have commitments to reduce fossil fuel consumption and increase our share of renewable energy. Supreme Court has seen both these commitments in separate silos. On one side, the Supreme Court has said that clean energy projects are a must. They are necessary. Solar, wind energy projects are necessary to reduce emissions, to reduce the adverse effect of climate change. That is how the basic human right, the basic fundamental right can be protected. So this was a landmark ruling. But however, Supreme Court has not struck down these solar and wind projects, which are a threat to the very survival of great Indian bustard. So for non-humans, this right won't apply, essentially. The right to have a protection against adverse impact of climate change is only for humans, as per the M.K. Ranjitsinh judgment. It will not apply for non-humans like animals and birds. So the writer is pointing out the links that exist between climate action and biodiversity conservation. They actually go hand in hand. Climate action, which is reduction of emissions, mitigation of climate impact, it goes hand in hand with biodiversity conservation. They are both connected to each other. But Supreme Court refused to see this link in the M.K. Ranjitsinh judgment. That's why the writer is calling upon the judiciary to introduce the concept of just transition. Any transition to clean energy, to a decarbonized economy, has to be just and fair, not just to humans, not just to vulnerable populations, but even to non-humans and biodiversity and environment. See, you would have heard that when economies are transitioning, right, when they are moving towards cleaner fuels, it tends to have an impact on weaker sections, poor communities. It tends to have an impact on vulnerable sections like fishermen, forest dwellers, tribal communities, farmers, etc. So when we recognize the need for just and equitable transition to reduce the disproportionate impact on weaker sections amongst humans, why can't we see the impact the transition will have on environment and biodiversity as well? Now, clean projects in Gujarat, Rajasthan, if it leads to the extinction of great Indian bustard, won't that affect our environment? Won't that eventually affect humans as well? Won't that impact our climate action efforts? So the writer is arguing that the two are connected. If a basic right is being given to humans with regard to protection against adverse impact of climate change, the same should be extended to the environment, to non-humans as well. And it's important for the court and the governments to see the interlinkage between biodiversity conservation and climate action, which is missing in the M.K. Ranjitsinh judgment. That's why the writer is calling for the concept of just transition. The concept was evolved in 1970s at the global level. It was inculcated in the Paris Agreement as well, that any economic transition towards a cleaner economy, a decarbonized economy, should be just, fair and equitable. Because weaker sections, vulnerable sections bear the bigger impact. But this concept of just transition right now is limited to humans, the weaker sections amongst humans. But writer is saying that we should expand this definition of just transition, cover non-humans as well, including our environment, our biodiversity, animals, birds, etc. Because climate change will affect our biodiversity and it's a vicious cycle. Extinction of species will further drive up climate change and it could be directly linked to extreme weather events. So the writer says that the judgment of M.K. Ranjitsinh, even though it's landmark on one side, on the other side it is short-sighted. It is looking at both the issues in separate silos. It's creating a distinction between climate action and conservation of biodiversity, when ideally both should be interlinked and interconnected. So that is what we take away from this important column. Now let's take a quick look at the prelims section. We have some important articles for prelims. On page 5, there's an article related to disaster management. In Kerala, following the deadly Wayanad landslides, there has been a call from the state government and also from leaders from across the political spectrum to declare the Wayanad landslide as a national disaster. They have been demanding the government of India to declare the Wayanad landslide as a national disaster. Now, this is a very controversial topic and it's important to have clarity on this, because it's not happening for the first time. Even a few years ago, when Kerala was hit by devastating floods in 2018, 2017, 2019 as well, there were similar demands that this disaster should be declared as a national disaster. Because the expectation here is that once it's declared as a national disaster, the assumption is there will be more support, more funds from the center to help the state cope with the impact. But this argument of political leaders and state governments is not correct. If you look at the legal framework in India, the institutional architecture in India for disaster management, there is nothing called as a national disaster. There is no concept of declaring a national disaster. The reference is the DM Act, the Disaster Management Act of 2005. The DM Act is what defines a disaster as a catastrophe, as a calamity or an unfortunate event which can result in large-scale loss of life, large-scale loss of property, infrastructure and damage to the environment, where the affected area is completely overwhelmed and it's not able to recover back to normalcy. So that is defined as a disaster or a catastrophe or a calamity. Now, as per the DM Act, the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is the nodal ministry for disaster management, has already notified 12 disasters. These are the notified disasters, which falls under the ambit of the Disaster Management Act. And I've given the list over here. It includes cyclone, drought, earthquake, fires, both industrial and forest fires, flood, tsunami, hailstorm, landslide, avalanche, cloudburst, pest attack, frost and cold wave. So all these hazards, they are classified as notified disasters by the Home Ministry. Now, once a disaster is notified, as per the provisions of DM Act by the Home Ministry, they will come under the ambit of the disaster management authorities, the National Disaster Management Authority, State Level Disaster Management Authority, District Level Disaster Management Authorities. This will allow the center and the states to mobilize the response forces, be it NDRF or SDRF. This will allow the center and the states to draw the funds from National Disaster Response Fund, the State Disaster Response Fund, and even the newly created National Disaster Mitigation Fund if required for mitigation efforts. The moment a disaster is notified by the Home Ministry as a notified disaster, then all the assistance will be given by the center to the states. Be it the provision of NDRF forces for supplementing the capabilities of the state, because states have the primary responsibility to provide emergency relief and response, right? Because states have a primary obligation under the DM Act. So they are to carry out the search and rescue operations, give immediate compensation, provide immediate assistance in the form of food, medicines, first aid, etc. The center supports the states by providing NDRF, by providing the army and other security forces if necessary, be it army, navy, air force will be called in, along with maybe Central Armed Police Forces if necessary. So center is always ready to supplement the resources and even provide the NDRF forces so that the state can appropriately use them. And through NDRF, the National Disaster Response Fund, there is a contribution made into the State Disaster Response Fund, which the states have to utilize for these response measures. Right? The center already provides majority of the funding here. For regular states, general category states, funding is 75 to 25 ratio. Right? This is as per Finance Commission recommendations. 75% comes from the NDRF to SDRF funds. 25% is raised by the states. For special states, the hilly and the more vulnerable disaster-prone states, funding ratio is 90:10. So center is already providing majority of the funds, and if required, there is a provision to request additional funds as well beyond what NDRF allocation has been done. If let's say the states have exhausted SDRF funds, if there is a severe calamity, they can always demand additional funds. The center will appoint a committee. MHA and NDMA, they will appoint an interministerial team which will visit the affected region, carry out an assessment, submit a report. They will recommend to the Home Ministry regarding the additional funds to be released. Depending on this, the center will either accept or reject the recommendations. So there is already a provision for additional funds if necessary. But there is nothing called a national disaster in India. This is something political parties and state governments need to realize. Is that clear? Maybe in other countries like US, for example, in United States, there is a need for a presidential order to classify a severe calamity as a national disaster to bring in more support and assistance. But that's not the case in India. Let's say, for example, even if Home Ministry classifies something as a national disaster, it will not serve any purpose. The same support, the same supplementary support will already be provided by the center. Because for all notified disasters, the center is obligated under the DM Act. So there's no legal provision as such to declare something as a national disaster. So the states are either politicizing it or they are simply not aware of these provisions. Next, on page 16, we have an article regarding some of the drugs which are very useful for treating rare diseases or dealing with pandemics, those drugs which have a defense application as well. Right? So these drugs are not accessible easily. Usually they are developed abroad by foreign pharmaceutical firms. So when they have to enter the Indian market, they have to undergo new clinical trials. According to the previous rules that existed, right? The drug regulator, CDSCO, Central Drug Standard Control Organization, it implements the new drugs and clinical trial rules. New drugs and clinical trial rules of 2019. So under the new drugs and clinical trial rules of 2019, the CDSCO has imposed few standards for drug testing and clinical trials before they are introduced in the Indian market. So this was making the entry of foreign drugs more complicated. Foreign drugs which have critical applications in treating rare diseases, in dealing with pandemics, which had defense applications, they were not accessible and affordable in India because the foreign drug manufacturers had to conduct fresh clinical trials in India to get the regulatory approval to sell the drug in the Indian market. This was seen as a hurdle. So now this has been simplified by the CDSCO. It has amended the new drugs and clinical trial rules, and it will be exempting some drugs if they have already been approved in some of the listed countries. In developed countries where there are stringent drug standards like US, UK, Japan, Australia, Canada and EU. In these markets, if a certain drug has already obtained approval after clinical trials, then those drugs can enter the Indian market without any need for new clinical trials. This will save the time, reduce the money involved for the company as well to roll out the drug in the Indian market, and it will make it more accessible and it will bring down the price. It will make it more affordable. So this is a change as far as some important critical drugs are concerned. Next, on the Science and Tech supplement section of the Hindu, we have an article related to DNA profiling. I'm sure all of you know, in forensic sciences, DNA profiling is seen as sacrosanct. You would have seen a lot of movies, web series, right, and even docu-series referring to the role of DNA profiling when it comes to investigations and eventual prosecution of the accused. But this article sheds light on the fallibility of DNA profiling. Recently, there was a ruling by the Madras High Court, it was in June 2024, where it reversed the conviction of a rape accused. The rape accused had been convicted earlier based on DNA evidence. But later, the High Court determined that there was a possibility of the DNA profiling being incorrect based on scientific evidence. And eventually, it rolled back the conviction, which raises questions about the reliability of DNA profiling. See, there is no doubt that DNA profiling is immensely helpful as an investigative tool, right? Because humans, we have a unique genetic structure. Though 99% of our DNA is pretty much the same, there's no difference at all. There are these repeats, there are these STR repeats or short tandem repeats, which is unique to each individual, right? And it helps in tracing parental lineage as well. It helps in establishing blood contacts or blood relatives. This is a very critical tool in investigation and also at the crime scene where DNA evidence might be lifted from hair samples to fluid samples. If this can be matched with the accused, that is conclusive proof in a way to establish the case and prosecute the accused. So studies have shown that yes, DNA profiling is very accurate. It's almost 99.9% accurate. But there is a possibility of DNA profiling going wrong as well. Is that clear? That's what the editorial is focused upon. It's not as foolproof as we all have assumed. Most of us have assumed that DNA profiling is foolproof, that once a DNA test confirms a match, we have assumed that it's absolutely correct. But you should be open to the possibility that DNA profiling may not be correct all the time. Even though the chances are less, very less, still there is a possibility. So if you just rely on DNA profiling without relying on other corroborative evidence, then you might end up punishing an innocent, which is a grave injustice. It's a grave derailment of justice. If you look at our DNA, there are 4 essential nucleotides or bases, the AGTC, adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. This structure, this sequence remains the same for most humans. It's 99% a same match. So when a DNA profiling is done, right, the experts, the forensic experts, they focus on a certain segment, which is called a loci. They pick out a certain section of your DNA, right, where they would like to focus to pick out the match with the samples that have been collected. This focal region where the study is focused on, that is called the loci. So at the loci, there will be these repeats, these short tandem repeats, which is unique. This is what sets apart every individual, right? That's why DNA profiling can be a great tool in identification. But problem here is that these genetic repeats, it's a genetic factor. There is a possibility of the match going wrong because of the inaccuracy that is also present in the tests. And given the similarities in the samples, in the genetic sequence and the slight changes that occur at these alleles, it's not 100% conclusive proof to establish a case. It can be 99.9% accurate. That's why courts have to be careful, investigators have to be careful, that you can't blindly rely on DNA evidence alone. Yes, it is a solid evidence, but you also need corroborative evidence. There should be other proofs as well to convict the accused. This is a very important learning lesson in this court, in this particular case in Madras High Court. Right? The High Court has set aside the conviction by pointing out the fallibility of DNA profiling. It's not 100% foolproof as it has been assumed. So technically, even technicians agree, experts agree, there is a slight margin of error, and whatever slight margin of error exists, it should be taken into account. If you use only this as a basis and convict someone, you'll end up punishing maybe an innocent who was not even involved in the crime. So you need corroborative evidence, you need other backup evidence which can substantiate with the DNA evidence. So that is essentially the takeaway from this article. Coming to the last topic, on the same page, we have this article related to WHO, the World Health Organization. It has notified 30 deadly pathogens on the future pandemic list. It has identified a set of bacteria and viruses which have the potential to start the next pandemic, just like SARS coronavirus 2. So this list includes the pathogens of priority. It's a pathogen prioritization list that WHO brings out every now and then. So it includes some of the subgenus members of the SARS coronavirus family, the Sarbeco-virus, for example. It also includes the Nipah and Zika, which are already listed as a public health emergency of international concern. Meaning, Nipah, Zika, with the right mutation, they have the potential to turn into a global pandemic. Now, India is already affected by Nipah and Zika in certain pockets. So that's why it becomes of more concern for us. Then, H5 subtype of avian influenza has been listed. Several bacteria that cause plague, cholera, the non-typhoidal salmonella, and those bacteria causing dysentery, pneumonia, certain specific bacterial strains also have been identified, and you can see the list over here. And Southeast Asia, which is the hub of most deadly pathogens, it finds a mention of some of the deadly bacteria and viruses, including the Banda virus, the Henipah virus, which is the Nipah, which is seen in Malaysia as well, right? So along with Vibrio, cholera, and other bacterial types, there are many viruses listed as well. And a total of 30 pathogens have been placed on this priority list. So this requires greater surveillance, greater epidemic monitoring at the ground level, because with the right mutation, with the right conditions, these pathogens can turn into a deadly pathogen that can trigger the next global wave of pandemic. Right, and I hope you know that pandemics do have apocalyptic potential, and experts believe that climate change is driving more such deadly pathogens to break out, leading to epidemics and pandemics. So WHO maintains a list of such deadly pathogens which have the potential to cause a pandemic, and it lists some of them as public health emergency of international concern. If there are any outbreaks, those outbreaks are specifically listed as public health emergency of international concern, so that the concerned governments can pay more attention, implement all the standard protocols, from enhanced surveillance to testing to quarantine, right? Follow the standard protocols so that we contain the spread and the outbreak to the local region itself. So that is what we learned from this article and from today's newspaper, and I hope you guys have enjoyed the session and learnt all the key topics. So if you did benefit from the session, do let me know through your comments, and do press the like button. That is it for today. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.